Okay, we're ready to continue on today in John chapter 15. Chapters 15 and 16 and 17 here, all the events recorded in these three chapters occurred during the walk that Jesus and the 11 made through Jerusalem after they left the upstairs room. Here in verse 31 of chapter 14, it says, "Arise, let us go from here." Okay, so we know they left the upstairs room, and it's during that course from the leaving the upstairs room until they finally reached the gate from which they would leave the city, which we read about in the first verse of chapter 18. It's then that they finally left and crossed the Kidron Valley. So that would probably have been the bridge of the Red Heifer that they had to cross the Kidron Valley. So anyway, that would be the event, and in order for everything to chronologically fit, these three chapters have to be wedged in between leaving the upstairs and leaving the city. Okay, so verse 1 of chapter 15, Jesus makes the statement, "I am the true vine." Not just I'm the vine, I am the true vine. Now, in order to help his disciples have a better understanding or a better grasp of how they were to be in union or united with him and the Father, which he mentioned here in verse 20 of chapter 14, just a few verses back, he now begins using an agricultural allegory to which each one of them could easily relate. Now, he may have begun this teaching by intentionally, after leaving the upstairs room, walking by the temple. So they could have gone by the temple, and as they walked by the temple, he could have drawn their attention to the large golden vine that Josephus claims was hanging. I think it was actually placed within the way the temple was made, but there was this giant vine with these giant clusters of grapes, about the size of a man, Josephus, I think, states, that was across the top of the temple, the front of the temple, above the doors, the leave doors that would open for the priest to go into the holy place. Not the Holy of Holies, but the holy place. And so there's this giant vine, was made of gold or gold-plated or whatever, according to Josephus, that was located there. As God the Word, he, the man, the one who was Jesus Christ, inspired several of his prophets to use the vine as well as the vineyard as symbols for Israel. They symbolized the nation of Israel. Israel was depicted as a vine. Let's go back to Psalm 80, 80th Psalm. We find here that Israel was depicted as a vine that God had brought out of Egypt and planted in the land that he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He removed the people there, or at least he removed some of them, and Israel was supposed to drive the rest of them out because they didn't want to do everything God said. But here in verse 8, Psalm 80, I'll read from the Tanakh translation. You, a reference to God, as you get the context from earlier, you plucked up a vine from Egypt. You expelled nations and planted it. You cleared a place for it. It took deep root and filled the land. That is the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so this was, again, of course, the nation of Israel being brought out of Egypt under Moses and to the land of promise. And God planted them there. As that vine, Israel alone had contact with the true God. Chosen as his firstborn, as, again, God told Moses, you tell Pharaoh, back there in Exodus chapter 4, you tell Pharaoh that Israel is my firstborn. Okay, so it's his firstborn son, his firstborn nation, if you will. This is his nation. And so it is his firstborn. And as that vine as his firstborn. Israel was to have been a vine that spread throughout the world. It would just continue to creep and go throughout the world to carry the nourishment of the truth of God to all other nations. Israel was to be the example. However, as the prophets bring out very clearly, due to their carnality, or to its carnality, the nation itself never succeeded in accomplishing what the vine was supposed to do, but rather it degenerated, we're told in Jeremiah chapter 2. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 21. That vine that was supposed to have been the vehicle by which all nations could learn the truth, degenerated, as we see here, into a vine that brought reproach on the name of God. Because here in verse 21, breaking into verse 21, God says, I had planted you a noble vine. You were to be noble, something that all would look up to, would respect, a seed of highest quality. What was the origin of that vine? The seed of Abraham. The seed of Abraham. And Abraham, God said, I can trust Abraham because I know that he will teach his sons and their sons and whatever on down the line the way to do things, to be obedient to me. And so it was a seed of highest quality that gave rise to this vine. How then have you turned before me into the degenerate plant of an alien vine? You're no longer a fruitful vine. You're an alien vine, something that is unlike anything that I wanted of you. In fact, just the opposite. Israel was also identified, back here in Isaiah chapter 5, as God's vineyard during the time that God worked among those who composed the nation. Here in chapter 5, verse 7, this whole chapter is dealing with Israel, the vine, the vineyard. And he says, for the vineyard, Isaiah 5, verse 7, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is, note, the house of Israel. The house of Israel. Because he worked there. It was his vineyard. And in that vineyard, he worked with the individuals in that vineyard, primarily the prophets, as we know. But there were other individuals, and we have that story in the former prophets of what occurred and how God worked with them. The prophets, again, clearly reveal Israel's failure to be God's true vine, the one and only, the true vine. But even though they show that, they also, at least Isaiah does, back in Isaiah chapter 53, shows the origin and existence of the true vine. Prophets reveal Israel's failure, but also reveals the origin and existence of the true vine. Here in Isaiah 53, verse 2, for he, that's the Messiah. Go back here, the last couple of verses of chapter 52, you see it's my servant. Well, my servant is the Messiah. And it says here that he, the Messiah, shall grow up before him. Him here is a reference to God, God the Father, as a tender plant and as a root. Here's the word root. Root out of dry ground. Now this prophecy in Isaiah 53 focuses on how God the Father watched over his Son throughout the entire time he lived as a mortal, when he was a tender plant. Something that's tender can easily be destroyed. And he was mortal. He was mortal. When combined with the earlier prophecy about the Messiah being a branch that would grow out of the root of Jesse, in other words, he would be a descendant of David. That's back in chapter 11, verse 1 of Isaiah. When we combine that with this prophecy, the tender plant is emphasizing the limited time of physical life that the Messiah would experience. This is not going to be something where he would live for centuries or millennia. but he would only be temporary, a tender plant. And also the root. Root out of dry ground here, getting back to David, emphasizes the connection of God the Father to his birth and his spiritual nourishment. As we all know, any of us that garden or try to have a house plant or whatever else, plants cannot live without moisture being taken in by their roots, and likewise, once pulled out of the soil and the roots are then exposed to the air, we all know what happens. The plant dries out. And once it dries to a certain point, it's dead. If you can somehow nurse it back with a little, put it in some water for a little bit, it might spring back. But if it's out for any length of time, it's dead. It withers very quickly. The Messiah's spiritual origin and the presence of the Father's Spirit without measure, as we're told in the accounts of the Gospels, was symbolized by a root. That's what the root symbolized. It's a root that's severed from the ground. That is, it's not taking in nourishment from the earth. It's taking it in from other places. That nourishment that it needed is taken in from where? If it's out of the ground, it's taken in from, it's the Spirit. That root is nourished by the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the Father, symbolized by, we know earlier back in chapter 3 when Jesus was talking to Nicodemus, he's trying to figure this out, this thing of being born from above and of being of spirit. It's like the wind. You can't see it. It's invisible. And so here you have a root out of the ground, and yet it's still living. It's still thriving, unlike a physical plant. You take it out, it's going to die, but not this root. It continues to supply because it's being nourished from something invisible. It's being nourished by the Spirit of God. That root, which was sent by and overseen by the Father, grew into the true vine that we find again back here in John chapter 15, verse 1. That vine brought the nourishment of the truth of God into the world. That root was supplied by the Spirit, and that root produced the vine that then does exactly what Israel failed to do, to spread, to creep throughout the world so that all nations know the truth. So again, I am the true vine, verse 1, and my Father is the vine dresser, or some translations have the gardener. The Father is the owner of all land on this planet. We know from Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Everything belongs to Him. He's also the owner of the vine. He's the one that planted it. He has complete control of the vine as well as of all of its branches. He has total control. Verse 2, I'll read from the Complete Jewish Bible. Every branch which is part of me, but fails to bear fruit, he, the vine dresser, the gardener, the Father, cuts off, or Goodspeed says trims away. He trims it away. A branch, as we all know, is a stem or a shoot that emerges from the trunk or arms that form the primary vine. Up here, where we produce so much wine here in Washington State, you drive by these vineyards and you have the main upright root but the main part of the vine coming out of the ground attached to the roots, and then they go out so far, and then those arms are cut off, and so you have basically a T shape of all of these vines, and then the new growth comes on the vines and spreads out, and they have to be pruned every year in order to keep your fruit production. So the branch or the shoot is what comes from the arms or the trunk of the primary vine. Each branch receives the water and nourishment necessary for life from that vine, from the base of the vine. The fruit that's mentioned here in this verse refers to what God has designed to grow naturally from the nourishment that's provided to the branches of the parent plant. The kind of fruit that must be produced by those who are united to or in union with Jesus Christ can only be accomplished by using the Spirit which flows from Him. He's the vine. We must take the nourishment that comes and flows from Him. And those fruits are referred to back in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, as the fruit of the Spirit. The only way that fruit can be produced is by the Spirit flowing from the vine into the branches. Can be produced in no other way. The Father, who takes meticulous care of the vine and he carefully observes the branches of the vine to determine whether or not they can be productive. He's got to analyze that. That's what anyone, you go out to a vineyard and this branch needs to be cut off. This branch has died. This branch produces no fruit. And he, the gardener, the vine dresser, he observes very closely whether it's being productive or whether it's not. Unproductive branches fail to fulfill the reason for their existence. The whole reason they're there is to produce fruit. The vineyard owner is not going to put up with a branch that's not producing fruit. That's its reason for existence. And also, unproductive branches inhibit the production of fruit on other branches, and therefore they must be removed. They not only are of no use, but they also are in the way of and hinder the development of other branches. There are those who attempt to attach themselves to Christ. They claim Him as their master. Master. We remember Matthew chapter 7 where it talks about how they glory in their own works, their own physical works. Oh, have we not done this? Have we not done that? And we've all done it, and we've used your name. We've attached ourselves to you, and yet they fail. Jesus says there toward the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, they have failed to do the will of the Father. And as a result, it shows there that they're cut off from Him. They're cut off because they're not doing the will of the Father. They're not producing fruit. They, like Judas Iscariot, may have joined themselves to Him physically, but failed to produce the required fruit because they were simply not part of Him spiritually. There was a physical connection, but not a spiritual. Ultimately, like the tares or the weeds that are first gathered and burned that Matthew talks about, or that Jesus mentions back in Matthew chapter 13, just like them, those who are not spiritually connected, and therefore, if they're not spiritually connected, they're spiritually dead. Those who are spiritually dead will be cut off and removed from the vine because dead wood can contain disease or rot, which, again, adversely affects the living wood of the vine. It has to be gotten rid of. He goes on in verse 2 in Complete Jewish Bible, and every branch that does bear fruit, unlike the first, he prunes, the vineyard owner, the gardener, the vine dresser, he prunes it so that it may bear more fruit. For those who are spiritually united to or in union with Christ, pruning is an absolute necessity. It is necessary. Pruning or trimming away part of a productive. In pruning, you're not cutting the whole branch off. You're just pruning, you're taking away part of that branch in order to eliminate old wood and to stimulate the vine to produce new growth on that branch, which in turn will yield greater fruit production. That's the whole purpose of pruning, is to get new wood. And it's the new wood where your fruit is going to come from, where your grapes are going to grow from. The Father's primary concern is keeping the branches of his vine healthy and productive. Because again, that's their purpose for being. Those branches are to produce fruit. Without the fruit, they're of no value to him. Verse 3, you are already clean or pruned, Goodspeed has, because of, or through, the King James says, through the word, or because of the word which I have spoken to you. Now he states here, you are already clean. Now earlier that evening, at the time he concluded washing their feet, Jesus had told all 12, including Judas, that they were not all clean. And again, it was due to the presence of Judas. Judas was not clean, but the 11 were. However, unlike Judas, the other 11 had repented before being baptized by John the Baptist, as we saw back when we went through that section, which made them clean, which prepared them to follow the Messiah, the messenger of the Father. In following him, they learned from his teaching. Through the 3.5 years they accompanied him, they learned their need, or they learned from what he had told them in different teachings. Some of it, certainly Sermon on the Mount. There's no way to go through that. You heard it said of old that, if you hate a person or whatever, it's okay, if it's an enemy. Oh, no, I'm telling you no. If you hate someone, you're in jeopardy of losing your eternal life. Oh, and to commit adultery, just to think about it, you're consigning yourself to eternal death. I mean, he explained that, and so as they follow his teaching, they learn how insidious sin is. It's incredibly insidious in its effect on the mind. And they learn the need they had of obeying the 10 Commandments in the Spirit, inside their minds, so that they would remain repentant and alert to thoughts that could lead them to sin. And again, help them to understand the need to cleanse their minds of those thoughts. In addition, as the true vine, he had delivered to them the pure word of God, which led them to believe on him as the Messiah, as the one who truly had come from God and had prepared them. What he had taught them prepared them for the indwelling of God's Spirit, which would come to them on the day of Pentecost, 54 days after this evening event occurred. Verse 4, Goodspeed goes on, you must remain, no, you must, no other option, remain united to me, and I will remain united to you. Just as no branch can bear fruit by itself unless it remains united to the vine, you cannot unless you remain united to me. Anytime a branch is broken off of a vine, or we could even say a branch off a tree, a plant, a tomato plant, whatever else we may have, it dies and it begins to wither away. And eventually it will completely dry out. Attempting to live one's life without continually, every second of every day, maintaining connection with the Logos or the spokesman of God will lead to the cessation of the production of the fruit of the Spirit. And it will yield the same result as breaking a limb off of a plant. Same thing. It will dry up spiritually. We'll dry up if we cut ourselves off. This union is addressed by the Apostle Paul back in Galatians 2:20, one of those memory verses. In Galatians 2:20, the Apostle Paul writes that God lives in me. And he says, the life which I now live, I live by the faith of the Son of God. So he saw the absolute necessity of being in union with, to have the presence of Christ in him. Going on in verse 5, Goodspeed continues, I am the vine. You, he's talking to his disciples, you are the branches. Anyone who remains united to me, with me united to him, will be very fruitful. For you cannot do anything apart from me. He is the vine that flourishes by the presence of the gardener, God the Father. It's through his relationship with the Father that he flourishes. He, the vine, provides the nourishment of the Spirit that flows from him, which is required by the branches in order to retain life and thrive in the production of the fruit that's required. Again, listed in Galatians 5:22 and 23. Verse 6, Complete Jewish Bible translates, unless a person remains united with me, he is thrown away like a branch, that is, like a dead branch, and dries up. Such branches are gathered and thrown into the fire where they are burned up. Now, this verse addresses only a branch that had been legitimately, spiritually united to the vine. Earlier, he talked about some that kind of attached themselves. There was not a spiritual connection, but a physical connection, like those in Matthew 7:21 through 23. But here he says, he's talking about a branch that had been spiritually united to the vine. If a branch makes the willful decision to pursue a way of life apart from the vine, it will cut itself completely off from the vine and sever itself from the nourishment of the Spirit that's required for life, that only the vine can provide. Because you can't get it anywhere else. There's no other source. You can't go attach yourself to something else and get that Spirit. There's only one. There's only one vine, the true vine. Such a decision will bring about irreversible consequences. Since there's no useful purpose for dead vine branches, their disposal is quickly achieved by fire. You just can't find any use for dead vines. I've got 40-something vines in my yard, and you just can't find any use. You just got to throw them in a pile and burn them. Can't make anything out of them. Here in Hebrews chapter 10, the Apostle Paul addresses what happens to those who were spiritually connected as a branch, and then, because of something that went haywire in their thinking, they became dead branches. It says here in Hebrews 10, verse 26, I'll read this from the New English Translation. For if we deliberately keep on sinning after receiving the knowledge of the truth, no further sacrifice for sins is left for us, but only a certain, notice, not a questionable or a doubtful, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume God's enemies. It's talking about utter destruction, utter obliteration. That's all that's left for those who deliberately, it says, keep on sinning, which are those who, again, have been cut off from the vine. They've cut themselves off from the spiritual nourishment. They've dried up. Nothing can be done but to burn them, because there's nothing spiritual there. Going on in verse 7 of chapter 15 of John, if you abide in me, or the Complete Jewish Bible, if you remain united with me, and my words abide or remain in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. The manner of being united with Christ is through obedience to the Word He has taught and through prayer. That's how we are united to Him, or how we unite ourselves to Him. It is a spiritual connection, but that's what must be done. He had already told the 11 that He would do whatever they asked in His name. Just looking back up here in chapter 14, verse 14. He promised there He would do whatever they ask in His name. Here, He refines that statement by showing that they must first of all be seeking God's will. I mean, He's making that by making the term "my words." You know, if you remain united with me and my words abide in you. My words, the things I've told you. What did He tell them? He told them God's will. He transmitted what the Father had told Him to them. So, again, God's will is contained within the teaching that He, as the messenger from the Father, had brought to them. If a request, based upon what He promises here, if whatever you desire shall be done, if a request will help accomplish God's will in one's life, or will not interfere with that accomplishment, Jesus says it will be fulfilled, if you really believe it, and if you're doing what is required to be done. Verse 8, Goodspeed translates, when you are very fruitful, or when you bear much fruit, the New King James says, and show yourselves to be, or prove to be, the New American Standard says, disciples of mine, my Father is honored. My Father is honored. It's an honor for the vineyard owner to have a strong, healthy, and productive vine. The evidence of a true disciple of Christ is a life filled with much of the fruit of the Spirit. Verse 9, as the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide, or remain, other translations have, remain in my love. Because of His outgoing concern, His agape for His Son, the Father never deserted Jesus any time during His physical life, except at the very, very end, when He, His Son, took upon Himself the sins of the world and became the bearer of sin. The Apostle Paul tells us about that back in 2 Corinthians 5. But He became the bearer of sins, so the Father had to turn away. Now, because of His outgoing concern for His disciples, Jesus had never deserted them from the time that He had selected them to be His disciples. He had always been available. He was always there at their side. He now exhorts them to emulate the example of love that both He and the Father had already established. We've set the example. Now I'm just telling you, as my disciples, you need to do what we have done. He goes on in verse 10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in, or you will retain my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide, or retain, His love. And again, we saw last time, His commandments, He was God the Word. He spoke those words, the 10 commandments, from atop Mount Sinai. And so He transmitted the words, the commands of the Father to Israel. And Moses recorded them, and we have them to this day. Now, the Father, again, as it says, as we just read in the previous verse, the Father was never separated from Him because Jesus had always been obedient. He had always been obedient. It is sin. Isaiah tells us, back in Isaiah 59, it's sin that cuts one off from God. Here in Isaiah 59, breaking into verse 2, your iniquities or sins have separated you from your God, and your sins have hidden His face from you, so that He will not hear. That cuts him off. It's your sins. And Jesus never sinned. And so, there was always a connection. There was never a separation, only at that last moment when he became the bearer of sin. The only way to remain attached to the true vine and never separated from Christ is to be obedient to his commandments. That's love. 1 John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5, one of those memory verses, verse 3. 1 John 5:3. For this is the love of God. What is the love of God? That we keep his commandments. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple definition. What's the love of God? Keep his commandments. The Apostle Paul elaborates even further in Romans chapter 13 and beginning in verse 8. Romans 13, verse 8. Here he writes, owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, now he tells us, he makes it very clear what law he's talking about, what commandments he's talking about. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Straightforward. Can be no question what keeping the law means and what the love of God is. Back in chapter 15 again, verse 11, these things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain, or as the complete Bible, Jewish Bible has, be. That my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full or complete, as some translations have. That your joy may be complete. Jesus now concludes the allegory of him being the vine and they being the branches by pointing to the joy that they would possess once they fully comprehended the allegory. Because they didn't fully comprehend it yet. They did not have the Spirit to help them fully comprehend it at this point. But they would. He had experienced joy in knowing that the Father was pleased with him because he was careful to obey the Father. Obedience was the key. That same joy would be theirs, would be the 11's after receiving the Spirit. Galatians 5:22 says one of the fruits of the Spirit is joy. But that joy would be theirs after they received the Spirit at Pentecost. They too would grasp that the Father was pleased with them because they were careful to use His Spirit to succeed in obeying Him just like His Son, the Christ, had done. Verse 12, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Now, he had already stated this earlier, somewhere back in chapter 13, but now he continues to explain just how far his love would go. In verse 13, greater love, can't get any greater than this, can't be any more magnanimous than this, has no one than this. Greater love is no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. To lay down his life. This act is the greatest expression of love, the giving of one's life for another. Jesus gave his life by literally suffering death on behalf of all of humanity, which was his reason for coming when we go back to chapter 3 of John, verses 16 and 17. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten. Okay, we know the verse. He expects his followers to also be willing to put others before themselves. In fact, back in 1 John, again, chapter 3. 1 John 3, verse 16. By this we know love. How do we know love? Because he laid down his life for us. And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. So John records that back in 1 John 3:16. This type of sacrifice is to be done on a daily basis through the giving of ourselves to help and assist our spiritual family, which are our friends. Lay down one's life for his friends. Jesus says there's no greater love. It's the greatest expression of love. And he goes on in verse 14 of chapter 15 of John, you are my friends if you do whatever I command you. Obedience is the requirement for being a friend of Christ. You must do exactly what he did. Follow his example to a T. All the way through. From keeping the Sabbath to laying down his life. Obedience is the requirement. His sacrifice is not applied until one repents of sins by acknowledging the need to be obedient to God's way of life. Only then is one considered to be a friend. Christ's sacrifice is not made for any who continue in disobedience. So you can't say, God, I'm going to choose Sunday. That's going to be my Sabbath. No, that's not obedience. People who do it because they're deceived, but you're not doing it the way God says to do it. God says the seventh day is the only day that can be holy, other than an annual Sabbath here and there. That's it. Sundays, except for Pentecost and maybe a few times you find feast falling on it, is not the Sabbath. Can't be made holy. Okay, verse 15. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all things that I heard from my Father I have made known to you. Now earlier, back in chapter 13, he had indeed referred to them as being servants. You call me master, and you are saying correctly, I am your master. That makes them his servants. Okay, that's what he told them back then, back at the time that he had washed feet and so on. A servant is required to do whatever his master tells him to do without being given a reason. Well, master, you want me to do this, but why do you want me to? Nope, don't ask. Don't ask. If your master says it, you just do it. That's the way the relationship master to servant is. A friend, on the other hand, confides in his friends what his intentions are. He says, I'm going to do this, or I would like to do that, and I want to let you know because you're my friend. I want to let you know what I'm doing. Jesus had now disclosed to his disciples all that the Father had committed to him to do. And so he was their friend, and they were his friends because he was confiding with them. Verse 16 continues in the Complete Jewish Bible, you did not choose me. I chose you. Now, no one can choose to be a branch on the true vine. They just can't decide they're going to be one. Those branches are added by invitation only. It's the only way it can happen. Remember chapter 6, verse 65, where Jesus said, here in the latter part of the verse, "No one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by my Father." So you can't just decide, I'm going to do it. Nope. If the Father has not begun the process, it can't be done. So you did not choose me. I chose you. You didn't come here because you just decided you wanted to. There was something that took place in your mind to be where you wanted to even come to what John the Baptist was teaching. You know, it's the Father who makes the decisions on who are to be added to the true vine at this time. All of the true disciples had been selected, that is, among the disciples of John. They had all been selected by the Father before Jesus came among them and chose the 11 from among them. He also chose Judas, but there are only 11 that were truly disciples, that were clean, because Judas was not clean. We saw that earlier. Going on in verse 16, "And I have commissioned you," or appointed you, "to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last." He did appoint them, as far as their personal lives. Each one of them as a branch had to produce fruit. But he's also talking here, and more specifically, about his commission, the commission that he had given them. He had spent 3.5 years training them what the truth was, the truth of God. Training them then to be teachers of that truth, and sending them out even on at least 2 occasions, from what the synoptic accounts bring out, to practice what he had trained them to do. And so they had been on training missions as well. He had appointed them to be apostles. Go back to Matthew chapter 10. They were called apostles. And he again called them apostles to represent him by teaching others the message that he had brought and delivered to them, and by testifying about all of the things that he had done while they were with him. The Father would draw the people he selected to the apostles to hear and act on the message they brought by repenting and surrendering their lives to his Son. So he says, I've appointed you, or I've commissioned you to go and bear fruit. And here he's talking about fruit as far as being added to the family. Other friends that will be brought into the family. Fruit that will last. And so they were commissioned to that end. But he goes on in verse 16, "So that whatever you ask from my Father in my name, he may give it you." He had earlier told them, again, just back up here about midpoint in chapter 14, verses 13 here and 14. He had told them here that he would do whatever they asked in his name. Now, here in the latter part of verse 16, he focuses on the Father giving them whatever they ask from the Father in his name. If they obeyed and fulfilled what they had been commissioned to do. But they had to do that. They had to fulfill the commission of bearing fruit. Verse 17, "These things I command you, that you love one another." This is a command. It's not a suggestion. If you feel up to it, I want you to love one another. But, if you wake up, don't feel like it, don't worry about it. No, that's not what it says here. I command. A command means it's ongoing all the time, just like the Sabbath command. It's every week is the 7th day. Every week there's a 7th day. Every week there's a holy day that we're supposed to get together, assemble ourselves with those who have the Spirit of God. And the same here. It's a command. The command that you love one another. Since love is the keeping of the commandments, the command here is to live by the commandments and thereby show love to and concern, outgoing concern to others, as we just read earlier in Romans 13, verses 8 through 10. Love is the fulfilling of the law. Verse 18, the Goodspeed translates, if the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. The world, or the Greek cosmos, refers to the present or the current arrangement of things. And it usually refers to this present evil world, the defiled state of the world today. And of course, that defiled state is due to Satan's current control and influence over the world, something that was given to him when Adam disobeyed God and surrendered the dominion that had been given to Adam to the devil, to the serpent back in the Garden of Eden. Now, the world or cosmos here can also refer to any affected part of that defiled condition in the world today. The first source of hatred, because he's talking about they hated me first. If the world hates you, remember they hated me first. And the first source of that hatred would be experienced by his disciples would be from the religious leaders of the Jews. The ones who had already declared, Jesus had already declared to be like their father Satan. Remember chapter 8, verse 44? You are of your father, the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning. You're no different because you're going to do the same thing. That hatred that the Jewish religious leaders there in Jerusalem had would also extend beyond the Jewish community there, as the gospel was taken into the world by the apostles then and even by disciples throughout the centuries that followed. You know, Paul found, where did he run into hatred? At synagogues, because the word had spread from the religious Jews in Jerusalem to the various synagogues, and that's where he ran into the problems. And then, of course, that mushroomed to other parts of society in the Roman Empire. So, the world hates you. Remember, it hated me first. If you belong to the world, I'll read verse 19 from Moffat. If you belonged to the world would love what it owned, or would love its own. It is because you do not belong to the world, because I have chosen you from or out of the world, that the world hates you. The world rejects all who do not walk in the way of its current ruler. That's just the way it is. In Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2 and in verse 2. Here the Apostle Paul writes, breaking into verse 2, you once walked according to the course of this world, this cosmos. You once were a part of it. You lived your way of life according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, those who are disobeying God, which is mankind. Satan works in all who refuse to obey God. Works in every one of them. His ability to deceive the whole world, or all of mankind, as we're told back in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, is manifested in the incessant attacks on everything that God has declared to be good. Everything that God has said is according to His will. The world works against it. The destruction of the marriage institution, that's the devil. Because God wanted a man and a woman to come together to form a union that would last till the day they died. But that's not the way the world's done it. The world's done it a totally different way. The promotion of perversion to destroy the minds of children, teaching them from kindergarten. They don't know whether they're a boy or a girl. An elephant, a giraffe. Total confusion. Total confusion. Because they want to destroy the family. They want to destroy the next. And this is coming from Satan the devil. The murder of tens of millions of babies through abortions are only a small sampling. These are only a small sampling of the power that Satan is currently exerting over all of humanity. And any who resist the devil, we need to keep this in mind with what we're facing in the future, like next week and the week after and next month. I mean, it's right on top of us. Any who resist the devil are known by the devil. He knows where we live. He knows. And he will use his deceived minions to deal with those who resist. That's what happened with Jesus, and that's what happened to the apostles. And we can't expect it not to happen to us. Verse 20. Remember the word that I said to you, or remember what I said to you, Goodspeed says. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. Now he mentioned, again, the servant-master relationship back there in chapter 13 after doing the foot washing and the example that he set. He informs them that as his apostles, they will experience exactly what they had seen him experience. Everything that you saw, you're going to go through some of the same things. Because remember, some of them, at least one of them, was put to death pretty much the same way. Crucified. According to tradition, Peter was crucified upside down. So, you've seen it happen to me. It's going to happen to you. There would be many who belonged to Satan who would seek to destroy them because of the work that they had been given to do. And the devil knew them because he knew who the disciples were, and he knew where that spirit works that is so opposed to his spirit, his demonic spirit. In verse 20 goes on, if they kept my word, if they persecuted you, they'll persecute you. Or if they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. So he's telling us, and contrary-wise, there would also be a few who through their work as the apostles would be drawn out of this present evil cosmos by the Father and would be added to the vine. Through the work that you do, what you do in going out and witnessing about me, it's going to bear fruit. Now, it's not going to be like all of the bad that's going to come against you, but you're still going to be useful in that way. The Father will draw people, and he will make sure they make connection with the work of the apostles so that their minds can be open to see the truth and they can be turned to the Savior. Verse 21, but all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, or on my account, or as my disciples, different translations have, because they do not know him who sent me. Those not drawn out of this world by the Father to his Son will be driven by this hatred, because they are ignorant both intellectually and spiritually. They're intellectually and spiritually ignorant. Intellectually, they think they know God, but in reality, they know only a God made in their image, that they have concocted from preconceived ideas derived from things that they have heard literally from their youth forward that men have taught them about God. Spiritually, if they're neither atheist nor agnostic, they have been led to believe they know God by the ministers of Satan who teach another Jesus, have a different spirit, and provide a different gospel that the Apostle Paul tells us about back in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. So in reality, they remain ignorant of the true God as well. If they knew him, if they knew the true God, if they knew the Father, they would be terrified at the thought of hurting his Son or hurting those who follow his Son. Remember, the Apostle Paul tells us back in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 8, he says, had the rulers of this world known, really understood, they wouldn't have touched the Messiah. They would have been scared to death to do anything to him. But they didn't. They were in ignorance. Verse 22, if I had not come and spoken to them, notice, if I had not come so that they could see me, and spoken to them, they would have no sin. Or the Revised English Bible says, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. The hostility of the religious leaders was also due to resentment of both Jesus' life as well as his teachings. His selfless example amplified the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and other religious leaders. His teachings revealed that change must originate from within the mind. That's where it's got to start. Obedience is not simply to consist of a facade to be worn on the outside, as was so common among the Pharisees. Remember back in the Sermon on the Mount, back in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, you don't be like the hypocrites. And he was talking about the religious leaders because they want to draw attention to themselves when they do charitable works. They want to draw attention to themselves when they pray. They want to draw attention to themselves when they fast. That's what they want to do. It's all an outward show. He said, no, all of this stuff you do privately. So your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is. In other words, you keep that totally to it's your relationship with God is a private relationship. But that wasn't the way it was with them. He goes on in verse 23. He who hates me hates my Father also. Because of the perfect union that existed between the Father and his Son, whatever is thought or felt about either one is then automatically projected to the other. John tells us about that even back in 1 John chapter 2. 1 John 2 verse 23. He says, whoever denies the Son does not have the Father either. He who acknowledges the Son has the Father also. So there's the connection. You can't have one without the other. And we're not talking about Trinity either. But there's a relationship, a bond, a strong bond that exists there. He goes on here in verse 24 of John 15, from the Complete Jewish Bible Translation, if I had not done, now he's already talked about coming and speaking to the religious leaders. Now he says, if I had not done in their presence works which no one else ever did, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have seen them and have hated both me and my Father. In addition to hearing his teaching and observing his example, in the second verse up from this, they had also, the religious leaders had also been witnesses of many of his miraculous works. Many of the miracles. The religious leaders claimed to represent God, which made them totally accountable to follow all of God's instructions. You can't say you represent someone and not do what that person you represent does. God the Word commanded Israel to hear and obey the prophet like Moses, who would be raised up from among them, and that he would hold them. God would hold them accountable, whoever it was that refused to hear and obey. Now, like Moses, prophet like Moses, remember, Moses did what? He taught. He taught God's word to Israel. What else did he do? He was also used by God to perform many miracles. So when you have an individual who comes among you, who teaches, you listen to what he has to say. And it's going to be verified by the works and the miracles he does, just like Moses did for Israel. You better listen or you're accountable. You will have sin. Again, Deuteronomy 18. Even though the works that Jesus had done, that had never been done before, such as raising Lazarus from the dead 4 days after he had died, that proved him, without question, to be that prophet. Rather than accepting him as that prophet and obeying him as instructed in the Holy Scriptures, the religious leaders did what? They hated him. They hated him, and they plotted his murder. So they did just the opposite. And Jesus says, had they not, well, there would be no sin. But they have. They've seen the works, they've seen the example, they've heard the teaching. They are all guilty of sin. They blatantly disobeyed God's instructions that Moses had recorded, and through their actions, they sinned by transgressing the first, the third, the fifth, and the sixth commandments. And you transgress one, you've transgressed them all. Verse 25, but this happened that the word might be fulfilled. That is, the fact that they saw, they heard, and yet they rejected. Okay? This happened that the word might be fulfilled, which is written in their law. They hated me without a cause. Now, Jesus here referred to this passage in Psalm 69, specifically within verse 4. That's where this comes from. Psalm 69, verse 4. They hated me without a cause. He referred to this passage being in their law. Now, he did that to emphasize that their hatred that they had toward him was prophesied in the Scriptures that they themselves regarded as holy and true. Because Psalms is part of the Holy Scriptures. The law, the prophets, and the writings are Psalms division. And so they all admitted that's Holy Scripture. And in the Holy Scripture it said they hated me without a cause. Their hatred was based solely on their jealousy of the impact of his ministry and the growing number of people who believed him to be the Messiah. The number of people who were following him. There was no sin that they could attribute to him that would justify their hatred. They hated me without a cause. Had he sinned, maybe they could have a reason. But he didn't sin. So there is no reason. They hated me without a cause because he was sinless. Verse 26. But when the Helper comes, whom again, as I mentioned before, remember, only two genders in the Greek. No neuter, just masculine, feminine. And so spirit should be neuter, and it should be it, not him. Okay, or whom in this case. But when the Helper comes, which I shall send to you from the Father. Now, prior to this time, Jesus had said that the Father sends the Spirit. That was back in the last chapter, last time, a couple of times, down here in verse 26 and verse 16. All right? He said there that the Father sends the Spirit. Now, he tells us here in verse 26 that he will send the Spirit after he returns to the Father. Now, there's no contradiction to this, because he also stated back in chapter 5, let me turn back and read that one, John 5, verse 19. Here, breaking into verse 19, he says, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For whatever he does, whatever the Father does, he, the Son, does in like manner. And so, he is the one who's been given authority until all enemies are put under his feet, as we know from 1 Corinthians 15. And therefore, he is the one who is acting from the authority of the Father to send the Spirit, which is, again, what we're seeing here in the first part of verse 26. Going back to verse 26, I shall send to you from the Father the Spirit of truth, which proceeds from the Father. It will testify of me. Now earlier, back in chapter 5, Jesus listed 5 witnesses that testified to his claim of being the one sent from God. The first one that he gave us was John the Baptist. The second was the work that he was performing among the people. And then he went on to talk about the Father being a witness of his coming. And then he talked about the Holy Scriptures as a whole being a witness. And then he pointed all the way down to Moses. Moses as the 5th witness. Now, here in verse 26, he adds a 6th witness, the Spirit of truth, which God uses to transmit inspiration to his disciples. Notice in Mark chapter 13. Mark 13 and verse 11. Here Jesus is telling them about what would happen after he was gone and after they began fulfilling the commission he gave them. He says, "But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak. But whatever is given you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit." In other words, God will inspire you to have the right words when that time comes. That's what he promised them. So the Spirit of truth is the 6th witness. Back in chapter 15, verse 27, "And you also will bear witness, because you have been with me from the beginning." The 7th and final witness is that of his disciples, specifically the apostles here, whom he appointed to be such, and gave them a commission to take that witness. These 11 had been with him and had accompanied him from the beginning of his ministry, hearing everything that he taught and observing all of the works that he had done. And there were others beside this 11, as we know. There are 2 that are mentioned in the book of Acts. And so, but they were the ones. They had seen, they had lived with him, they had eaten with him, they had, again, they were eyewitnesses to it all. And you, he says, you who've been with me from the beginning, you will bear witness. And so that would be the 7th and the final. And that brings us then to the close of chapter 15. So we will hold off till next time for the remainder.